In just a few short months, one woman rose from a pale shadow in the royal court to become Queen of all England. Jane Seymour, her name might seem like a fleeting note in the tragic symphony of the Tudor dynasty, was the woman Henry VIII once called his true love. But was it ever that simple? Was his affection truly for Jane herself, or for what she could give him, the male heir he longed for above all else? The irony is striking. Jane was praised as Henry's most beloved wife, yet she was also the one who left him the soonest. The affection, the honors, the royal devotion, all of it ended just 12 days after she fulfilled her duty by giving the king a son. Was that really love, or a suffocating bond that consumed her life and hurried her toward an end no one could prevent? If true love brings happiness, why did Jane Seymour have to pay for it with her life? If power always walks hand in hand with loneliness, then perhaps love in the hands of a king is nothing more than another form of power. Jane's story is not just a piece of cold history, but a searing tragedy that forces us to ask, between love and politics, has there ever been a clear line at all? England in the early 16th century was caught in a storm no one could quell. On the throne sat Henry VIII, a king whose hunger for absolute power was rivaled only by his obsession with producing a male heir, an obsession fierce enough to tear apart the order of the old world. To satisfy that desire, he dared what no English monarch had done before. He defied the authority of Rome, broke from the Catholic Church, and crowned himself head of the Church of England. The fallout rippled far beyond politics or religion, seeping into families and parishes, forcing ordinary men and women to choose between ancient faith and loyalty to their sovereign. The nation was split down the middle, and in the chaos, the Tudor court became a stage both dazzling and treacherous. Outwardly, the palace gleamed with feasts, golden attire, and honeyed words of praise for king and queen alike. But behind that glittering surface, the air was stifling, every smile masking a scheme, every handshake concealing either a promise or a blade waiting in the shadows. Women at court, no matter their titles or jewels, were often nothing more than pawns on a board of power, moved, married, elevated, or discarded at the whims of the men closest to the throne. It was in this atmosphere of turmoil that one tragedy had barely closed its curtain. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had defied the Pope and cast aside his first wife, now lay silenced beneath the axe. The echo of the executioner's stroke still haunted those who had witnessed it, the blood upon the stone not yet dry, when the palace was swiftly scrubbed clean to welcome another figure. Her name was Jane Seymour, once little noticed, now stepping through the doors of power in a silence heavy with calculation. Jane's arrival was no blaze of glory, but a shadow slipping into the void left by a bloody death. This was the soil in which her destiny would take root, a soil at once radiant and rotten, where every vow of love was tainted by suspicion, and every tender promise carried the scent of blood. And here, love, politics, and death were about to entwine, weaving the next dark chapter of the Tudor reign. Jane Seymour was never meant to be the center of history. She was not a princess with royal blood, nor a powerful countess with vast estates. She was simply the daughter of a minor noble family, raised in the quiet countryside of England. Had it not been for the storm that was Henry VIII, Jane might have lived out her days in a modest marriage, becoming a gentle wife and a quiet mother in the Seymour family's small estate, fading into time, as countless women of her era did. Her path into the palace did not begin with a queen's crown, but with a far humbler role, as a lady-in-waiting first to Queen Catherine of Aragon and later to Anne Boleyn. From that position, Jane learned how to observe, how to remain silent, how to let her softness become a shield in a world filled with danger. Where Anne was sharp, magnetic, and calculating, Jane appeared as her opposite, obedient, gentle, almost harmless. It was that very contrast that caught Henry's eye. To him, Jane seemed like the calm harbor he longed for after the storms of court politics and the tragedy of his marriage to Anne. Yet behind that soft exterior, was Jane truly just a meek woman swept along by fate? Or did she understand that silence and humility could be the sharpest weapons of all? Henry saw in her a safe refuge, but what did Jane see in him? A great love, or merely the only path to survival in a world where women were so easily destroyed? When she was hailed as the Savior Queen, Many believed Jane had restored stability to the realm, lifting Henry out of the shadows of scandal and betrayal. But the question lingers. In Jane's heart, was there ever a simple dream of love, or only the fierce desire to endure, a small human longing for survival in a game of power she never chose to play? Jane Seymour was never just the third wife in Henry VIII's long list of consorts. She was flesh and blood, carrying a gentleness that was both her gift and her curse, leaving history to remember her with equal measures of pity and unanswered doubt. Henry VIII, in the final stretch of his marriage to Anne Boleyn, was no longer the man he had once been. The king who had defied the Pope to marry the woman he loved now seemed weary, disillusioned, surrounded by whispers, lawsuits, and accusations of treason. Anne, once the burning flame of his passion, had become in his eyes the embodiment of betrayal. And in that darkness, Henry's gaze fell upon Jane Seymour, a gentle, quiet woman who seemed untouched by scandal or storm. To Henry, Jane was like a breath of calm after a raging tempest, a promise of the peace he had long craved. Their romance unfolded like a whirlwind. Even while Anne was still alive, Henry had begun courting Jane, showering her with precious gifts and penning letters full of longing. But unlike Anne, who had teased and challenged him, Jane held her ground with quiet dignity. She refused the lavish presents, replying that she could not accept them unless she did so with the honor befitting her station. That gentle refusal, a mix of softness and principle, only deepened Henry's obsession. To him, Jane was not just another woman, but the answer to his greatest torment, a stable marriage and a legitimate heir. On the day Anne Boleyn was executed, Jane Seymour was just a few chambers away. As the axe fell on the scaffold, preparations for a new wedding were already underway. And indeed, only 11 days later, Henry married Jane. It was a love story without pause, without mourning, driven by a sense of urgency, as though the king feared that any delay might cost him his long-awaited son. Jane was placed upon the throne as a declaration. The court had entered a new chapter. After Anne's scandal, Jane was carefully crafted into the image of the humble queen, a moral, meek, and proper woman who knew her place and carried no ambition beyond it. The court needed Jane, the country needed Jane, and Henry needed Jane. But the question lingered. Was she loved for who she truly was, or simply because she fit the mold everyone longed to see? The truth was that Henry VIII never separated love from politics. Behind every word of praise and every display of affection lurked the shadow of an unspoken contract. Jane Seymour became the instrument through which the king restored his image after chaos, the vessel for the prince the realm demanded. And Jane, however gentle, could not have been blind to this. Within the Tudor palace, every step she took was observed. People compared her to Anne, calling her the perfect opposite. If Anne had been fire, Jane was still water. If Anne was criticized for her sharp wit and intelligence, Jane was praised for her meekness. Yet that meekness was a double-edged sword. It shielded her from open hostility, but it also made her fragile, vulnerable to being swallowed by a world of power where the weak rarely survived. At times, Jane tried to step out from behind the mask of the obedient wife. She once pleaded with Henry to spare those who joined the Pilgrimage of Grace, a rebellion against his religious reforms. But Henry lashed out, ordering her to remember her place as a wife and not meddle in affairs of state. It was one of the rare glimpses of Jane attempting to assert herself, quickly silenced. After that, she withdrew further into quiet submission, letting her docility serve as her shield. What she truly thought beneath that silence, no one knew. Did she believe Henry truly loved her, or did she understand that his love could be as fragile as it had been with Catherine and Anne? Perhaps she, too, lived with the fear that her crown could crumble at any moment, that today's affection could become tomorrow's condemnation. The tragedy of Jane Seymour lies in her silence. She did not fight, did not scheme, did not play for spectacle. Yet it was in that very silence that the net of tragedy tightened, invisible but unrelenting. Henry saw in her his salvation, but that salvation was built upon the blood of Anne Boleyn and the crushing expectation that Jane must give him a son. It was a weight heavier than the crown itself, a chain she could not escape. And when love becomes a political contract, when gentleness turns into a set of iron shackles, the seeds of tragedy are already sown, even as Jane wore her glittering crown. But this was only the beginning. On October 12, 1537, Hampton Court Palace blazed with the joy England had awaited for years. After turbulent marriages, tears, and blood spilled on the scaffold, Henry VIII finally obtained what he desired most, a legitimate male heir. Jane Seymour, the gentle and quiet queen, had given birth to Prince Edward. Church bells rang across the kingdom. Crowds celebrated for days, and Henry wore the pride of a king who believed he had conquered fate. To him, this was not just a child, but proof of his dynasty's legitimacy. The promise that the Tudors would continue to reign. In those first days, Jane was bathed in glory. She had done what no wife before her could achieve. No longer were there doubts about her place in the king's heart, no whispers of insecurity, only hymns of praise and songs of triumph. She was hailed as the mother who saved the dynasty, and Henry called her his most beloved wife. But tragedy was waiting. Only days after Edward's birth, Jane's body began to fail. Childbed fever took hold, her temperature rising, her pain unrelenting. Behind the candlelit halls of celebration, within the cold stone walls of Hampton Court, Jane lay pale and still, her breaths shallow and labored. Smiles of joy soon gave way to anxious murmurs, and then to the sound of stifled weeping. Henry VIII, who had once signed Anne Boleyn's death warrant without hesitation, now found himself powerless. He sat at Jane's bedside, watching the woman who had given him his long-dreamed heir slip away. For the first time in his life, Henry faced an enemy that no decree, no sword, no ruthlessness could defeat: death itself. He could behead a queen, topple a pope, and reshape an entire kingdom, but he could not keep life within Jane's fragile frame. It unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy. The jubilation of Edward's birth still echoed, even as horror spread with Jane's rapid decline. Servants ran frantically for physicians. Priests were summoned to whisper final prayers. And Henry, who so often seemed cold and unyielding, sat no longer as a monarch, but as a desperate man, helplessly watching the one he loved most fade away. On October 24, 1537, just 12 days after bringing a prince into the world, Jane Seymour drew her last breath. The palace fell into a silence heavy and suffocating, a stark contrast to the jubilant bells of less than 2 weeks before. Henry's greatest joy had been purchased at the cruelest price: Jane's life. It was a bargain so brutal that even history shudders to recall it. The throne had scarcely warmed beneath her when Jane was gone, leaving behind an infant son and a king crushed by grief. Henry had his heir, but he had lost the woman he believed was his true love. In that moment of fate, a bitter truth emerged. Under the weight of power, love is rarely pure. It carries a price, and for Jane Seymour, that price was her very life. Her death stunned the Tudor court. Joy and mourning twisted together in a merciless knot. One cannot help but wonder, did Jane know what awaited her when she became queen? Did she ever imagine that the title of most beloved wife would come hand in hand with such a swift death? History gives no answer, but the shadow of injustice lingers, a reminder that beneath the glitter of a crown lies not always happiness, but sometimes a sentence. Jane Seymour's passing marked the climax of the tragedy, not with plots or blades, but with a woman's body broken after giving life. Yet it is precisely that quietness, that gentle departure, that deepens the pain. It forces us to confront the cruelty of fate, that love can deliver glory in one moment and death in the next. And in that silence, one haunting question remains. Was Jane truly loved for who she was, or only because she gave Henry what he desired most? Perhaps the answer will never be known. But her death carved an unhealed wound into the story of love, power, and the terrible costs they demand. Jane Seymour's funeral was marked with a solemn grandeur rarely seen. The entire court donned mourning attire, and the tolling bells seemed to etch the nation's grief into memory. She was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, not only as a queen who had fulfilled her duty, but as a central figure in the unfolding tragedy of the Tudors. Years later, when Henry VIII died, he chose to be buried beside Jane, the only one among his 6 wives. To many, that decision stood as proof of true love, a final declaration that Jane was the real wife of the king's heart. And yet, Jane's quietness in life makes that honor feel deeply conflicted. From her days as a lady-in-waiting to her short reign as queen, she never truly had a voice of her own, never the space to express her desires or ambitions. Was she truly happy, knowing her marriage was built upon the blood of Anne Boleyn? Did giving Henry a son bring her comfort, or was it merely the prelude to her early death? What lingers in history is the image of two tombs side by side. Many tell it as a sign of undying love, but on closer look, it feels more like proof that tragedy outlives those who suffer it. Jane Seymour is gone, yet her death, her silence, and the unanswered question of her happiness continue to echo through the centuries. And as the story closes, it leaves behind a hollow space in the mind of the listener, as if her tale has never truly ended. In today's world, how many people believe they are living in a love that will endure, when in truth, they are only a link in someone else's design? Jane Seymour, the woman who seemed to capture the heart of Henry VIII, was left only with silence and a death that came too soon. Was she truly loved, or was she merely a piece placed at the right moment to give the king what he desired most, a male heir? If Jane believed in her love, then was her passing proof that love always demands sacrifice? Or was it only an illusion crafted by power, hiding the truth that in the Game of Thrones, there is no room for personal happiness? That question lingers not just for Jane, but for us as well, as countless people still confuse devotion with being used. The story of Jane Seymour reminds us that love and power are not always opposites. Often they intertwine so deeply that they cannot be separated, and it is in that entanglement where the darkest tragedies are born. When night falls and the story ends, what remains is not a romance, but a haunting question. In our own lives, are we truly loved, or are we simply playing a role in someone else's game? If you wish to continue exploring the forgotten fates of history, the lives both magnificent and fragile, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.